welcome everyone. Very much looking forward to the session today from Helen and hosted by Jonathan. So I'm going to sort of hand over to Jonathan now. Jonathan is going to just provide you with a bit of an introduction on the session today, and then over to Helen to kick the presentation off. Without any further ado, over to you, Jonathan, really.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and welcome everybody. My name's Jonathan Norman, and I volunteer for the Nuclear Industry Project Management SIG, which is co-owned by the Nuclear Institute and by the APM. And this is one of 3 webinars that we're doing on the sort of general theme of moving from lessons learned to shared learning. And I'll let you have details of the next one. I'll put that in the chat towards the end of the webinar. But in the meantime, I'll just put into the chat, I'll just put the details of the SIG's LinkedIn page where you can find us, and do get involved, talk to us, tell us what you'd like, tell us what you're interested in, and ultimately tell us how you found this event. So I'm delighted that Helen said that she would do this for us. She would talk about storytelling through the kind of lens of archaeology and the HS2 project. So Helen is head of historic environment at HS2, and that's all I shall say now, Helen, and I'll hand over to you and turn off my camera. So over to you, Helen.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you everybody else for spending taking time out of your lunch break to be here today. But I suspect you are thinking, why is she here talking about archaeology? What is that relevant to me? Why is that relevant? And what can I learn that I can apply to my role? Well, we have placed storytelling at the heart of our discipline. And as a discipline, we say historic environment, meaning archaeology, built heritage, historic landscapes. I will inevitably just talk about archaeology as a bit of a shorthand. But as a discipline in the commercial sphere, we've perhaps been seen as a little niche, dare I say, irrelevant to developments and construction. And so we work very hard to explain our role, our purpose, our methods, and our requirements. And I'm sure you all do. Those words will resonate, I'm sure, in your daily life. So at the heart of our vision, telling the story of a nation. And we began that really early in our process. The picture that you're seeing here is of the discovery of a time capsule underneath a foundation stone of the National Temperance Hospital in London, just outside Euston, which was an unlisted historic building, which we had to demolish for our works. But in it, the founders included papers of the day about the work of the temperance movement. So already at some very early works, this is about 5 years ago, we're beginning to tell people about the past and what we're discovering. And so in time-honoured tradition, I hope you're sitting comfortably, and I will begin. Once upon a time, a high-speed railway was planned. Now I'm going to actually focus on phase 1, which is a section from London to the West Midlands, because that's where we've completed our field work. So all of the imagery comes from that. As you're aware, HS2 goes on to Crewe, and then we're in Parliament at the moment for the section up to Manchester. So now I'm focusing on this first section because we have some great discoveries and some stories to tell and some lessons to share. I will, the project goes on much further. So, but before we could build bridges, tunnels, tracks and stations, an unprecedented amount of archaeological work was undertaken. And it was and is a unique opportunity to learn about our nation's heritage. But context is everything, so I need to set the scene. The words on screen are our objective from HS2's environmental policy, which obviously covers not just historic environment, but biodiversity and a whole range of other disciplines. And the slide and the words neatly introduces our narrative arc, the sequence of our work, the expectations of what we're going to achieve. It also introduces a rather fabulous medium for engagement, a Lego model to scale of St Mary's Church at Stoke Mandeville. Demonstrates a couple of things. One, creativity, and also what happens to archaeologists when they're a long way from home for a long period of time. We will be returning to St Mary's later. And like you, our work is undertaken in accordance with a series of requirements, commitments, and standards. We have to demonstrate public benefit and value for money for the taxpayer. These are all relevant to your business and your experience too. And we start our works with an historic environment research and delivery strategy, which abbreviates rather nicely to HERDS. And that's founded on 3 pillars: creating knowledge, not just about our past, but also, because that's what captures everybody's imagination. What were the Romans doing? What were prehistoric people were doing? How did the post-medieval people in London and Birmingham work? But also we want to improve investigation techniques and working practices, so create knowledge in that sphere. We want to involve people, the communities and the groups along the route, and we're having a massive impact on their day-to-day life. We want to help them understand their local history and excite them about the past. And also, like many of us in our profession, we do want to leave a legacy for future generations, and that's not just through the archive that we generate, the artifacts and the massive amounts of digital information we're generating, but also improving industry practice, inspiring the next generation of archaeologists, and hoping again to get communities involved in their local heritage, caring for the place that they inhabit and they work or they visit. So what I'm proposing to do now is to use some of the discoveries that we've made on phase 1 of High Speed 2 to highlight a range of stories that we've told to a range of groups, explain a little bit about how we did them and our interactions. And in your role, you have to adapt your communication style to your audience and the outcomes that you're seeking to achieve, whether that you're talking to technical specialists, the auditors, senior management, or a new graduate in post. And you probably do that unconsciously. So let's start with treasure. Sadly, such discoveries are not a regular occurrence on archaeological works, but they are the ones that capture the imagination of individuals and the public in general. And the Treasure Act 1996 gives us strict legal requirements to comply with. We have coroners to inform, the landowner to communicate with, security to consider, and of course we want to highlight the discovery. We work really closely with our communication and media team to ensure that we provide the correct information to the correct people and manage expectations. As you might imagine, when you put a press release out like this, people want to know precisely where it is, so they can perhaps go and metal detect land nearby. We don't want to encourage that. Metal detecting without a license is generally frowned upon in archaeological circles, often illegal. So we have a lot of information to balance and a lot of communications to actually make sure we hit the mark. We don't want to annoy the landowner, because often we're on their land with permission, as opposed to a CPO order, a compulsory purchase order. So there's an awful lot of engagement that goes into these sorts of discoveries. And to explain actually what you're looking at are potins. They are an early form of coinage, as you might have gathered, and they date back to the late Iron Age, so sort of 1st century BC. And we've named it the Hillingdon Hoard because remarkably it was found in West London near Hillingdon. And it was buried at a period of great change when the Romans were beginning to establish themselves in Britain. And we know that it was buried, what would have been buried in some sort of leather pouch that's long since disintegrated, but it has held the coinage together. And they were manufactured or based on a manufacture in Marseille in France. And they have a picture of the head of Apollo on one side and a bull on the other side. Not particularly easy to see on those images, but a really exciting find for archaeologists. But I don't know if many of you or any of you have come across archaeological works in your profession, and I thought it would be useful to show you the process of research, survey and excavation in one location. And it highlights how long our works can take. I've been on the project for over 10.5 years. And yes, we've just finished field work on phase 1. We have our post-excavation work to happen, which is going to take another 8 years or so. We're in the field for phase 2A, and then we're in Parliament at the moment for our hybrid bill for phase 2B up to Manchester. So it's a long process. And what you're looking at on the screen here is top left LiDAR, which is light detecting and ranging. It's quite a magical technique which penetrates vegetation and allows you to see beneath trees in a way that aerial photograph doesn't allow. You've got an earthworks survey top right, and then the earthworks bottom left, and then a geophysical survey bottom right. All techniques which we use before we even put a spade in the ground, and they all build our knowledge so that we can plan for the next steps, because we need to go back and talk to the construction engineers and the designers about what they're going to do. Can they bring their design? Can they do their design in a different way to avoid it? If not, does cutting have to be that wide? Does the bridge pier have to be in that location? And obviously we need to cost the works as well, and we need to program them. So we have to have a clear plan of what we're trying to achieve. But despite all that research, we still get unexpected discovery. Yes, we revealed the remains of Coles Hill Manor and its hexagonal moat, which I hope you can make out on the image there. And it had an impressive gate structure, all things that we predicted and we knew were going to be there. But the garden doesn't appear on any historical records. There are no plans of it. It's not mentioned in any letters or visitor accounts. But it is one of the best preserved late 16th century gardens ever discovered in the country. It included well-preserved gravel paths, planting beds, garden pavilion foundations, and ornaments organised on a geometric pattern. And it was parallels with the ornamental gardens at Kenilworth Castle and Hampton Court Palace, which is always a really nice parallel to be able to tell people. And its construction gives you an idea of the picture here gives you an idea of the main building complex. And I should say that historians have since worked out that Robert Digby, who had the gardens created, married very well to an Irish heiress. And they think that he expanded the site, created the gardens to basically display his newfound wealth. And they were over 300 metres long. And what's on screen are exhibition panels that we put in Coles Hill Town Hall, just to explain the ancient history of the area from the Bronze Age all the way into the medieval period. And it was a really effective way to quite quickly engage with the community. These panels went up a couple of years ago, I think actually possibly even pre-COVID, as we now like to measure time by. So just a very simple way to communicate quickly such important discoveries, in addition to the open days that we've been able to have, the lectures and the webinars that we've given. I'm going to take you back to St Mary's at Stoke Mandeville now. Now, this church is in Buckinghamshire and has been one of our most amazing sites. And probably if I had to pick a favourite site, I guess this would be it. We knew we were going to have exciting archaeology there. The church had already been demolished in the 1960s. The Victorian church that we knew was there was known to have Norman origins and a burial ground. Now, the picture you're looking at top left, the small picture, is what it looked like before HS2 started its works. So you can probably just make out basically tree cover and a sort of an irregular rectangle, which is the church and its graveyard. Underneath that is a recreation of what the church might have looked like. And the main picture you can see is the revealed footprint of the Victorian church after all the rubble has been removed. And those of you familiar with churches will be completely familiar with this setup. You can walk in the door on the top of the picture, walk down the nave. It really was quite an incredible sight. And while I touched on burial grounds, I thought I would just pause here to talk about human remains. On HS2, we've had 3 large burial grounds: St James's Gardens at Euston, Park Street Gardens at Birmingham, both post-medieval cemeteries, and a number of prehistoric and Roman excavations. And where construction has had to impact on burial grounds, we have a series of legal steps to take. Everybody is treated with dignity, care, and respect. What you are looking at here is a picture from a late Roman burial site at Fleet Marsden near Aylesbury, again in Buckinghamshire. And you may have spotted the rather unusual location of the head. In a burial ground of over 400 individuals, about 10% were buried this way, and it's interpreted either as a somewhat niche burial rite or the burial of criminals and outcasts. But part of our legal requirements and considerations were, if burials are over 100 years old, then there's an archaeological element, and that is the vast majority of human remains we found on HS2, ancient burials or over 100 years old, which is why there's an archaeological element to that. But we have undertakings and assurances with the Archbishop's Council of the Church of England, with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. We have to engage with the Ministry of Justice and local authority specialists and Historic England to make sure that the process that we've put in place, because we disapply normal legislation by our hybrid act of Parliament, but that we've got all the checks and balances in place to allow this to happen, to allow our works to progress. And I mentioned the Archbishop's Council of the Church of England because when it's a Church of England burial site, we have specific requirements to consider. And the next slide shows you what one of those requirements looks like in practice. This is back at St Mary's, and we had a commitment to the Archbishop's Council to shield the dead from view and to restrict access to only the people relevant to the works. The practical solution of that, where you're in a place where people might see things, is to tent it. That's what happened at Park Street in Birmingham and to St James's Gardens in London. So this massive tented structure was erected by our enabling works contractor, and it also helps keep the rain out. Archaeology, field archaeology, if you're a professional field archaeologist, a lot of the work is done during February, and it is cold and it is wet. So a tent is often an unexpected blessing. So let me take you inside. Now, this extensive archaeological site allowed our supply chain and ourselves to host a pop-up museum, a series of open days, specialist short courses, and a lot of that was actually during COVID. To comply with our human remains commitments, no human remains were visible during any of those activities, and so we were able to balance our commitments to dignity, care and respect by also our community engagement policy and practice, which is to share our discoveries as much as possible with as many people who are interested. And the community and beyond were hugely interested in St Mary's. But I couldn't talk about this site without mentioning our star finds and also highlighting how they help us to communicate with everybody, actually nationally, if not internationally. So if you remember the photograph of the church and its outline where we'd taken all the rubble off, archaeologists took all that, peeled back all the layers to understand construction and phasing and dating. And in the final stages of excavation, archaeologists were excavating this circular ditch. I hope you can make out the circle broadly on the image. And in the centre of the image, you can make out a square pit. And they thought that was the foundations of an Anglo-Saxon tower. And so having an Anglo-Saxon foundation for a Norman church, very exciting in the development of church archaeology. Clearly, if you go to a church today, they often have ancient elements and ancient origins, but you can't always dig them up. It's not allowed. But it's now thought that that square building was actually a Roman mausoleum. Roman materials and artifacts were found in the ditch, and they were really too ornate to be a domestic structure. And what appears to have happened is that the Roman building was demolished by the Normans when they started to build the church, but it was possibly reused during the Saxon period. So why am I excited about this? Well, it's not every day you're basically looking face to face with the people who were possibly buried in that mausoleum. So as they dug down into the ditch, they uncovered 3 stone busts that had obviously been thrown in there, because what Dr. Rachel Wood is doing on the left-hand side of the picture is actually holding the head on to the bust of the lady. We found an adult female, an adult male, and then the head of a child. So presumably the family that the mausoleum was erected for, they were exceptionally well preserved. And the further 2 images show the cleaned up statue, and you can see the hairstyle, possibly a wig, and it really does engage you with the individuals who are there. And archaeology isn't about different bits of pot and how big and deep and wide the ditches were. It's about people. It's about telling the story of the people from the past and making it relevant to us today and to the future. So I always like to put the people at the centre of any discovery that we make. We've had these on display at Aylesbury at Discover Bucks Museum. So if you get down there in the next week or so, they're still on display. And again, that's allowed us to share early artifacts that would normally take several years to actually get out into the community. So rather quickly, I am going to take you from the Romans at Stoke Mandeville and transport you to central Birmingham. Old Curzon Street Station, which you can see on the imagery at top left and bottom right, is about to undergo a transformative refurbishment. It's a Grade 1 listed building, and it's going to be integrated into High Speed 2's plans for the new Curzon Street Station. It was designed by notable architect Philip Hardwick and was opened in 1838, and it's now one of the oldest surviving pieces of monumental railway architecture. And before it was demolished in Euston, the Euston arches were a mirror to this construction. And it was obviously built in Birmingham in a period of massive growth for the city and is of great significance. And if I could draw your attention to the picture bottom left of a round circle, looks a tiny bit like the Millennium Falcon. And we unearthed an amazing discovery. I'm not normally a railway history nerd. I don't post-medieval archaeology, if you had to ask me my favourite, it's probably not my favourite, but we got excited about this because now we knew we were excavating railway heritage, railway architecture, archaeology beneath the railway. The whole area has been used for railway works since the 19th century. Somebody's just come off mute. And so we were trying to, we knew we were going to expose some interesting material. We did not expect a beautifully preserved roundhouse adjacent to the old station. Or rather, we expected it, but not the preservation. It's remarkable how we expected that further works would have dug it up, moved it, built over it, destroyed it. And that was designed by Robert Stevenson, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, and those of you who have been in and out of Euston Station will have probably walked past his statue, although we have moved it currently for safekeeping. And this was operational in 1837, and the roundhouse, and specifically the turntable, remarkably, was used to turn stations. So they came in on tracks, were sort of turned around, and the rectangles you can see there are called stables. So they were parked into the stables, they had inspection pits, but then they could be turned around and sent back down the line. So it's a sort of engine storage facility. That's why the term stable is used. And again, it generated a huge amount of interest and recording. We worked with Bradford University and Visualising Heritage so that they could take all the myriad ways that had been recorded to recreate what the building would have looked like, so that people very quickly had an understanding of the upstanding structure. If anybody of you have been to Derby, you might have seen the Roundhouse in Derby. Likewise, the music venue, the Camden Roundhouse in London. These are all examples of roundhouses. Ours is, doesn't have the above ground superstructure. It is now actually preserved underneath the railway works. But what I find particularly fascinating is the challenges that we were faced to record below that. So the engine house of the Roundhouse was coal-fired. So it had an engine room, and we had a coke vault linking the canal to the Roundhouse. So coke was taken off the barges, down the tunnels, and into the fires. But we couldn't send people down there because it was unstable. But we were really, really keen to understand what was below the ground. Also, it supplied information to our engineering colleagues who had to make it safe and had to know what they could build on top of it and all the impact that it had on them. So we were able to put 3D laser scanners into some of the voids and make these records. And I like it because it really gives you a feel for what it might have been like pulling or working in that environment, pushing those carts through and then servicing the Roundhouse. And again, a really sort of evocative image to be able to show people. And so this is quite a short piece, but I hope I've demonstrated some engaging ways that we have reached out to people. Not entirely sure I like that term, but we want to engage all ages from all over the UK. Obviously, there's a particular focus on the communities that we affect and the recognition that we do affect their environment, and therefore we have a duty to share what we know about their surroundings and help them understand that yes, we've built a railway, but we have, as much as you can, safeguarded their heritage and told the story of what's around. So we're ploughing our lessons learned back into the other phases of phase 2A, currently on the ground in the early stages of archaeological and enabling works, and then further on into the section from Crewe to Manchester. So one advantage of having several members of my team who have actually been with the project for several years now is you have that knowledge of the HS2 growing and becoming a more confident organisation, and then practices and working with colleagues, whether construction or digital BIM modelers, ecologists, everybody in between, to actually feed back into our processes. We work very closely with our community engagement team, and I mentioned our media and comms. And obviously I've included in this slide Britain's Biggest Dig, where we had a 3-part BBC TV programme focused on our burial grounds. And so you can read a bit about, or see a bit about St James's Gardens, Park Street, and then also they did touch on the early stages of St Mary's. We're particularly proud of that. And so that brings me really to the end. If you have any questions, I'm seeing quite a few of them popping up into the chat. I hope that's told you a little bit about my world and how it happens in practice. Happy to take any questions.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Helen. That was tremendous. I'm going to start with a sort of technical question or a factual question, really. I'm going to ignore Ashok's questions about cost, because as we agreed beforehand, you're not going to talk about the cost of HS2 very wisely. But Ashok has asked how many archaeologists are involved in the dig?
At one point, we had over 1,000 archaeologists on site. So that's spread across elements of phase 1. I don't have a really accurate count for how many people are unseen in the offices supporting them and in the various teams around the country that have contributed to that, but well over 1,000 archaeologists. And these are all professional organisations who employ professional archaeologists to undertake the work, but it's a massive, we're quite a small industry and we have employed pretty much all of them.
Fantastic. Yes, yes. The next question is from Bryn Hodgkiss. Bryn, I'm going to ask you to come on screen if you'd like, and ask your question, because I know you're a keen storyteller and your question is about storytelling.
Just unmuting myself in all the way I can. Thanks for the lovely presentation, Helen. I'd just be interested to hear how did people react when they heard your stories?
I think, well, I know that we are one of the most positive storytellers for HS2. We get the most hits, the most attendance at webinars, because our industry is used to, and we expect to tell people what we found, because otherwise, what's the point? We've had a really proactive relationship with our community engagement team and our comms and media team to actually get the stories out at the right time, work with them to do webinars, participate in things like the Festival of Archaeology, which is a national campaign. And so, yeah, the stats are really, really gratifying. A couple of million viewers plus, I think, for the various episodes of Britain's Biggest Dig. It doesn't sound a lot, but we were quite pleased with that. That apparently for BBC Two programme in excess of 2 million is quite good figures. Other than that, attendances at webinars is always really good. There's a lot of people on the call today. I spoke to the DFT a couple of weeks ago. We had 90 there. So hopefully really, really positive.
Yeah.
And how, and just I'm going to be cheeky and ask a follow-up. How does that then help the mission of HS2 more broadly? Because, you know, I like a good story. My sister's an archaeologist, so you've sold it to me. But how does this help sort of the corporate vision?
Well, I think as part of HS2, we want to be a good neighbour. Part of our policies is to be a good neighbour, to engage with the community. And because we're at the vanguard of the works, we're some of the, you know, because archaeology uses machinery on site, people are in hard hats and orange and safety goggles, people see the beginning of construction. So we're, I think, quite an important element to say, yes, the railway is being built, but we are considerate of your heritage, the archaeology. These are the standards we're working to. This is how we're doing it. Just like our ecological colleagues work to, you know, with bats, badgers, birds, all the sort of, you know, habitat creation work that they do in the vanguard of construction, telling people that we, again, massive construction is happening, but we are doing everything we can to reduce the impact that has had. We acknowledge there is an impact, but we have so many environmental requirements on us, whether it's air quality, noise, archaeology, carbon, built heritage, you name it, that we need to make sure that people understand that we're doing that. And part of my work is to communicate that out to people.
Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks for the question, Bryn. I let you off because you're asking questions that I was going to ask. But I think there's an immediate relevance there to the nuclear industry in terms of, you know, communicating how you are addressing some of these environmental issues and doing it so well. Got a great question, or a couple of questions, a linked question from Jake Middleton. Jake, do you want to come on and quickly ask your question?
Which one? I've asked two.
You can ask them both.
Yeah, I guess I'll start with the one that follows on around the storytelling, which is, how do you combat negative storytelling? So do you engage with critique when you get it, or do you focus on telling your own story and not engaging with naysayers?
It's really, really difficult, because I suppose if somebody is against HS2 conceptually, or just doesn't want it to happen because it impacts their land, it is actually very difficult to change their mind and make your point. have to explain the parameters we're working within, what that means. We try not to get involved. In fact, we don't get involved in, toing and froing on Twitter, for example, because I think that's probably quite dangerous. I have to be very careful and political in how I give my answers. So we do try to explain to people really carefully, and this is, as Jonathan's alluded to, for the nuclear industry must be a constant. What you're doing, why you're doing it, and giving them every chance to actually understand your position, but equally accepting that they are not necessarily going to agree with you.
Yeah, sounds interesting. Yeah, I'm thinking about context for my own projects at the moment. The second question I got was slightly different. I think you touched on it in your last answer as well, which is how do you measure how successful the engagement is? So is there anything that you've tried that's unsuccessful or successful? What data metrics are you using to kind of understand how that engagement works?
Okay, I can get you more information on this. I don't collect the metrics. When we have events like this, obviously, you can take how many people came on board, but when we have a specific media outlet, press releases and programs and events and things like that, then there's a whole set of metrics that the community engagement teams and the media and comms team take. So when we put out a Twitter story, we know how many people have retweeted it and all that type of thing. There's forms to fill in, or feedback forms like you're going to get today when you participate in an event, whether it's in a webinar or in person. So other teams actually measure all of that, and then we talk about whether or not that was actually worth it. Could we have done it better? What does the feedback say? In general, I like to say that if it's an archaeology focused event, we get really positive feedback. One great thing is that even though you may not like the construction and the impact it's having on your world, most people are interested in heritage. So it's quite a good in to engage, and that applies to construction engineers as well, who maybe you're having a conversation with about why that has to happen and why that can't happen. They're also people we need to tell our stories to, so they understand that we are part of the project as well, and they can't build the railway until we have done our work. They can't, until the ecologists have done their thing, the archaeologists have done their thing, just like utility diversions have to happen. We're all part of the project, and so that communication has to happen as well.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. We've got a question here from Kirsten, and it's a sort of similar question from Ashok as well. There's quite a lot of project managers on the call, so they're all worried about time cost and the other kind of drivers in the project. So Kirsten, do you want to come on and ask your question about the impact of what Helen does on the schedule?
Yeah, thanks. So my question was around, how do you manage the risk of the extent of time, cost and resources that might be required as a result of what you identify when you're doing some of your work?
Not quite sure if I'm going to answer this quite in your terminology, but the reason I've been on the project for over 10 years is that there's a lot of planning. The slide that I showed, the sequence of all the sort of non-intrusive work, is so that we can start to build that picture as quickly as possible, so that when we then have conversations with programmers about how much time we need, and they have to sequence that all in with seasonality like badgers and birds, utility diversions where maybe you've only got a specific time that work can happen, that all has to be factored in. And because we're part of the team, then that work is not without its challenges, but it is certainly easier, so that you can have that conversations. We build up our information base like everybody else, like the bridge engineers will about ground conditions. We're all about ground conditions as well. So how deep, how well has the archaeology survived? And we build that into the programme. So for phase 1, the archaeology, utility, early works, demolition, early road diversions, a bunch of other stuff were all managed by the enabling works contractor, sort of a management company that were given the task to organise all of that in order, so that before main works construction came on board, and they're on board now, we had done virtually all of the enabling, as much of the enabling works as possible. And so we worked really closely with those contractors to help them understand, and their specialist archaeological supply chain, what needed to be done, when, how, and reviewing and auditing their work.
No, that's really interesting. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. Well, I think we're pretty much out of time now. Helen, anything you'd like to close with before I kind of hand back to Sarah?
Not really. I hope everybody's enjoyed it. I will say, if any of you come into contact with archaeology in your day-to-day lives, early planning, bearing in mind the organisation I'm talking to, don't ignore it, don't leave it. Every time you hear about archaeology being a problem, somebody didn't think about it or give it enough attention early enough. That is mainly what I would suggest. So we're not there to get in the way, we're there to work with people. We're not all students, everybody is a professional that we're working with as well. So I hope or Housesteads on Hadrian's Wall gives you a little bit more of an insight. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you ever so much, Helen. That was tremendous, really fascinating, and I hope we've kind of shared some insights that will be relevant not just to the rail industry but also to nuclear and other industries. I just wanted to thank Sarah Slater and the APM team for supporting us so wonderfully with this, and to the APM in general and the Nuclear Institute, who are obviously supporting the SIG. And I've posted details of the next event, and I'll hand back to you, Sarah.
Really, it's just for me to say huge thank you to Helen and Jonathan again for coming to us with this idea of a webinar today. I can see it was very well received by everyone in the room, and we look forward to welcoming you back for future events. So thank you for joining us.